Funding is a crucial educational issue that is affecting teachers and students everywhere. We research this topic because no matter where we will teach in the future, it will always be relevant to us as educators. In 1917, the Smith-Hughes Act passed providing federal funding for education. By 1918, every state required students to complete elementary school. However, educational opportunity was not equal across the country. According to the article Historical Timeline of Public Education in the U.S., in the late 1970s, the so-called taxpayers' revolt led to the passage of Proposition 13 in California and measures like Proposition 2.5 in Massachusetts. These propositions froze property taxes, which were a major source of funding for public schools. Total educational funding has increased substantially in recent years at all levels of government. According to an article 10 Facts About K-12 Education Funding, by the end of 2005 school year, national K-12 education spending will have increased an estimated 105% since 1992, but it's still not enough. Malin states in The Prediction of States, PK-12 funding effort and distribution based on their ideological makeups that restoring school funding should be an urgent priority. Steep state-level K-12 spending cuts have serious consequences. One of these consequences includes the weakening of a key source of funds for school districts. Because state funding has been cut, local funds must try to make up for those state funds that they are no longer receiving the entirety of. Some communities do not possess sufficient taxable wealth to adequately fund their schools. These communities that cannot make up for the missing funds from the state have been in danger of closing and have actually had to lock their doors because they simply cannot afford to be open and teach their students. Another consequence to spending cuts is the economy's recovery from the recession is slowing, because the school districts are falling deeper and deeper into debt. So not only is the lack of state funding bad for the school districts and the students, it is also bad for the economy. According to the article Funding Gaps in 2015, too many states still spend less on educating students who need the most. In the state of Illinois, the highest poverty districts receive nearly 20% less state and local funding than the lowest poverty districts. This might have a correlation to what Malin said about how some communities just do not have the wealth to be able to help fund their school districts, but this does not explain why these high poverty districts receive less funding than other districts from the state. However, this could explain why these high poverty school districts do not perform as well as lower poverty school districts, because they do not have the same resources. This issue is so vital to students' education because it plays a big role in the opportunity gap. There is a misconception that there is an equal funding for all students. With research, that is clearly not the case. Because of this presumption that equal opportunity exists, people have the belief that the low levels of achievement with minority students is simply because of their genes, culture, and lack of effort. In fact, many minorities do not have the access to the same amount of key educational resources as others like skilled teachers and a quality curriculum. According to the article Unequal Opportunity, Race in Education written by Linda Hammond, the U.S. educational system is one of the most unequal in the industrialized world, and because of this, students routinely receive dramatically different learning opportunities solely based on their social status, creating an opportunity gap. European and Asian nations, for example, fund schools centrally and equally, whereas in the U.S. school districts, the wealthiest 10% spend nearly 10 times more than the poorest 10%. The spending ratios of 3 to 1 are common within the states. Even with all of the differences in funding, students are expected to learn and perform at the same standardized level, and if they don't, it's their fault. Not the fact that their teacher quality, curriculum, and class size may vary greatly. Linda Hammond states that educational experiences for minority students have continued to be substantially separate and unequal. Moving to the current state of the issue, according to Is School Funding Fair by Bruce Baker, since the recession in 2007, the school funding was cut, but due to the ARRA program, it was not as drastically as expected. Even so, since 2007, school funding has never fully rebounded from this event, and schools are not getting enough funding to provide adequate education. Looking at the numbers of the current state of funding, we find some shocking statistics. According to most states still funding school less than before the recession by Michael Leachman, states are providing less per pupil funding for kindergarten through 12th grade than they did 7 years ago. Often far less, they reduced levels reflect primarily on the lingering effects of the 2007-2009 recession. Most states are providing more funding per student in the new school year than they did a year ago, but funding has generally not increased enough to make up for the cuts in the past years. Currently, this issue is affecting students. According to the article, most states have cut school funding and some continue cutting by Michael Leachman, Because of the cuts from the recession in 2008, states have scaled back to raising more local revenue for their schools, but because property values have fallen sharply since the recession, it has been difficult for local school districts to raise revenue through the property taxes. When this takes place, schools must begin cutting jobs and spending on school resources such as specials programs such as ESL, after-school clubs, special education, support, school supplies, and much more which students need. The student population continues to rise every year, and with the schools having less teachers and money for resources, it is difficult to aid our students to achieve their highest potential. According to the article titled Inequality in District Funding and the Disparate Impact on Urban and Migrant School Children by Rachel Ostrander, she says, migrant and urban children are concentrated into low schools who currently receive less funding and who are statistically performing poorly on standardized assessments due to their highly divergent backgrounds and language barriers, and the tests are given in English only. This quote helps you understand that those who receive less funding are doing worse statistically, especially our English language learners who aren't getting the support due to funding. To add to it, students are taking standardized testing every year to test their achievement, and based on how they do, the school can be rewarded for their high scores, but in low-funded schools, they don't have the resources to equip their students to perform well on these tests. Ostrander says education is becoming focused on educational outputs as a measure of adequacy. As future teachers, it's frustrating to see how students are at a deficit when students have so much potential and so much to offer us. In the future, lawmakers must begin considering the fiscal 2018 budget. Congress must still take some kind of action in fiscal 2018. According to Colfer, while the chances appear good that defense spending will no longer be constrained by those caps, the future is less clear for education spending. There's a concern that an increase in defense spending could mean a corresponding decline in what's given to the education department, leading to fights over less money. It appears unlikely that President Donald Trump can convince Congress to give $20 billion for school choice, as he promised during his campaign. Every student deserves equal opportunity, and funding will provide the opportunity they deserve no matter where they come from. Cutting educational funding is like cutting the future.